Hey everybody, this series of Mystified Monday videos is for games that I am utterly baffled by for whatever reason. In the case of the games before you, Despair 1 and Despair 2, it's because not only are they just really crappy games to begin with, and there's a bunch of baffling things about them, but it's that I can barely find any information on them. All three were developed by U-Neek software, that's U-N-E-E-K, and if it weren't for this Power to Play disc that I have, I wouldn't even know that these games existed. So to briefly fill you in on what that is, it's a piece of software that was designed to help you run MS-DOS games on your Windows machine, specifically Windows 95 and 98. And in addition to this software, it also had a bunch of shareware games available on there as well, and there are some pretty good ones on there, but then there's these two, Despair 1 and 2, and they are interesting to say the least. Now, one thing you should know is that these were created using the pie-in-the-sky software 3D game creation system, which is basically a fairly rudimentary Doom clone engine. Although it really has way more in common with Wolfenstein 3D because there is no height simulation in this particular version of the engine. I don't know if they ever improved that and put it into later versions of the engine or not, because the only game that I've seen associated with the pie-in-the-sky 3D game creation system that has anything resembling height is a game called Pencil Whipped, and that came out considerably after these games were actually relevant. And not only that, but I'm more inclined to think that that was just an error on Moby Games' part, because that's where most of the information I can find on these games is, and there's not really much there. A couple of screenshots and it's like, hey, this is the developer, this is when it was released, and this is a first-person shooter. Well, gee, that's helpful. But anyway, best I can tell, it's basically a bunch of friends got together and decided to make a couple of first-person shooters, and they used this bizarre game engine to do it, and didn't seem to actually do all that much on their own. There's an awful lot of assets that are in use here that are common to this particular engine as far as I can tell, and it's all haphazardly slapped together with no semblance of any sort of level design skills, or really any sort of artistic vision. Thus you end up with stuff that is at odds with itself, sprite quality that is generally fairly poor, and it looks a lot like placeholder stuff in most regards. In fact, there's certain walls that don't even have textures on them, and they look kind of out of place as well as goofy. And hell, there was one texture on one of the walls that I could have sworn was ripped directly from Wolfenstein 3D, but I'm not 100% certain on that. And it's not like the sound design is any better. I mean, you've got sound effects that are very weak across the board, you've got music that is repetitive and actually pretty annoying, and it's basically just a bunch of 8 to 10 second loops over and over and over again, so it gets pretty tiring. Then of course there's the interface, which is clunky and just a mess to be able to use. I mean, to interact with your inventory, you press the S key and then move the arrow keys to whatever it is you want to select, and then you hit enter in order to actually use that thing. And it's just a clumsy way of doing it. Then when you move over to the main menu, the text is rather difficult to read at times, particularly on the save menu, and it just looks terrible. But what took the cake for me was the opening sequence to Despair 2, which I'm just gonna show you right here. That wasn't edited. That's literally how the thing opens before you get to the main menu, and I'm just kind of baffled by it. It's amusing, at the very least, because none of those things seem to have any relation to one another, but it doesn't exactly help you out with understanding the game itself. And on that regard, let me talk about the actual story and the gameplay. As best I can figure, the story is that an alien race called the Yara are somehow invading Earth, and it's up to you to stop them. and that's pretty much it. So you're just going around shooting a bunch of dudes who are infested by alien parasite or whatever the hell it is. And otherwise it really relies entirely on the gameplay, because nothing in this game makes any sense. There's basically no story to speak of in the actual game, so what you're ending up doing is just wandering around shooting stuff and picking up items and such like that. To that end, I've already mentioned that the inventory system is clunky and hard to work with, but on top of that, the limited number of item slots that you get means that you're going to have a hard time carrying everything that you need around, because a keycard, for example, takes up the same space as a machine gun or something like that. So you kind of have to pick and choose what weapons you're running around with, and it's kind of annoying. You can also pick up health packs, and those behave kind of oddly, because if you have a certain amount of health, then it just puts it into your inventory. But if you have anything less than that amount of health, then just walking over it will pick it up and instantly apply it to your health total. So it's just a weird mechanic that I'm not really sure why they did it that way. And if you pick up a key or a key card, then as long as it's in your inventory, you just run into the door that you're trying to open and it will open. But there is no real interact key. Instead, you get a bunch of buttons that will count as your fire button, and then you get your enter key, which is just kind of the general use key. It doesn't actually behave like a use key though, and that's pretty weird to get used to. Then you have your movement controls, and that's pretty much it, really. They are not complicated first-person shooters at all. In fact, they're what I would describe as overly simplistic given their convoluted nature. You see, the environments themselves are just mazes. They are labyrinths, and there's no other way to describe them, because that's exactly what they were going for. The problem is that their level design skills are atrocious. The levels themselves are extremely confusing. The navigation is a total disaster. They end up having a bunch of things hidden behind walls that you couldn't possibly know about unless you just bumped into every single wall in the game. There's things that are doors that shouldn't necessarily be seen as doors to begin with. There's things that aren't doors but look like doors, and then of course there's invisible walls where it looks like it's just a wide open doorway that you can walk through. It is confusing as hell. And thus you feel like a complete moron wandering around the maze trying to figure out where the hell you're supposed to go, and sometimes you're sitting there going, wait a minute, this key opened this door but there was nothing in there to do, and I couldn't interact with these people that were in there. What exactly am I doing again? And it only gets more convoluted as you continue through the game and try to decipher what the hell they were thinking regarding the actual level design. More importantly, you wonder what the hell is going on when you're actually trying to do anything in the game to begin with, because if you try to move along, then you're going to find that you actually move at a slight angle, and more often than not, you'll actually end up careening off to the side, usually the left, and you're not entirely sure why. It's because the game has this bizarre tendency to just have you start drifting off to the left or the right, mostly the left, and you just don't have much control over it other than to correct by actually turning around and trying to get around the scenery. It makes the movement feel incredibly clunky, and on top of that, you're having the problem of trying to actually shoot the enemies in this game. You'll notice that more often than not it is taking multiple shots to bring down enemies, but there's also times when it only takes one or two, and there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. That's because there is no rhyme or reason to it. The hit detection is incredibly wonky, and I can't tell if I'm actually hitting enemies or if they just have large health pools. It is a complete crapshoot. Doesn't make any sense at all, and it means that the shooting mechanics themselves feel downright terrible. And it's actually legitimately difficult to describe just how incredibly clunky these games feel. It's something you just kind of have to experience for yourself, and that's whether you're playing any game on this engine as far as I can tell, but I'm not 100% sure on that because I haven't played any of the other ones. Now, one thing I did note about it is that the level design seemed to get a bit better when you got to Despair 2. Now, maybe Despair 3, they actually learned from their mistakes in the first two Despair games and they improved the level design in that, but I very highly doubt that. And other than their odd, quirky value, I really can't see any reason at all to try these games out, to play them at all. They're just incredibly clunky. They're not fun, they're not funny to play, they're just obnoxious when you actually get into the games themselves and try to play them, only to find that they're just incredibly clunky and incredibly annoying. Where they're actually interesting is from a historical perspective, because this was one of the very early instances of games that were made on pre-made engines, which is something that is more known for things that use, say, RPG Maker or just Game Maker or any of these other pre-made engines that have a bunch of built-in assets and that people just tend to churn out games pretty quickly on to either make a quick buck or for practice or whatever it may well be. And it's kind of interesting seeing that these design trends just kind of stayed constant throughout both the 90s and on up to today, because now we have things like asset flips. And that's a rather annoying problem with the green light stuff, for example. But something like that would also happen back in the 90s as well with games like this. And hell, it was even happening before the 90s, but that's where gaming started to become a lot more popular, so it kicked off a bit more. And thus you end up with games like this that were slapped together haphazardly with not much semblance of real creative vision or any sort of artistic value or anything like that, and they end up just being completely forgotten, partly because they got no exposure whatsoever, and partly because they're just pieces of crap. And as a result, it's kind of hard to find information on games like this. Now, of course, that does seem to be for good reason, but at the same time, well, games don't necessarily deserve to be forgotten completely. There's something you can learn from every single video game out there, whether it be garbage, whether it be fantastic. And in this case, while I'm utterly baffled by the existence and the actual playstyle and everything of the Despair games, ultimately, they're just an interesting piece of history when you compare it to what's going on today with asset flips and a bunch of low-effort content put onto Steam Greenlight and such like that, and you really see that this is a problem that's been going on for a long time. But as for the Despair games, despite it being utterly baffling that I can barely find any information on them whatsoever, it's a pretty good thing that they were ultimately forgotten. Thanks for watching.